You may notice I'm sporting a very terrible British accent, and that is because Tony Temple, who was originally going to be covering this panel with Mr. Howard Scott Warshaw, was unable to make it to the That's why I'm now doing this panel. My name is Greg. I have a YouTube channel called Greg's Game Room. And Brandon wanted me to do this British accent, but I can't hold it anymore. I'm done. Can't do it anymore. So I have Tony's questions here, and the whole panel. So we're going to go through this here. So first of all, welcome everybody. Welcome. Our guest today is Howard Scott Warshaw, who has produced a trio of million-selling games in the early days of Atari, and then carelessly, sorry, starting that pop there, completely carelessly, brought down the whole video game industry with his one game, E.T., right? Or did he?
Don't bother to think.
He went on to become an author, a filmmaker, a photographer, a teacher, and a robot builder? You're building robots these days. Okay. Awesome, awesome. So please give a warm welcome to Mr. Once Upon a Atari, Mr. Howard.
It is really cool to be here. And also, what I do, I don't know how many of you know what I do now, currently. It's actually for the last decade. I'm a psychotherapist, which is that's the place to go when you're done with video games.
So thanks for joining us. So your time at Atari almost fell at the first hurdle. Tell us about how you got through the door in 1981.
How I got through the door. It was interesting because I don't know if a lot of people know this, but I found a joy for computers, a passion for programming in college, and I just loved it, especially microprocessors, which were brand new back then. And I loved it. I was doing the hell out of it, and I went to Hewlett-Packard, and it turns out Hewlett-Packard is like a software pasture where programmers go to die. And I was just so desperately unhappy and bored there because I had lost the passion I found. And then I heard, and I was also a zoo case at Atari because when I'm bored, I act out a lot. As opposed to when I'm not bored, when I just act out some. And I heard that there was this place Atari. I heard there was this place Atari where they do wacky stuff on a daily basis, and I thought I should check that out. Went there, and it turned out they did exactly the kind of programming, real-time control programming that I like to do. So I thought, this is the place I gotta go. Oh, and they make games? That's cool too, but that was like the third reason I wanted to go there. And I went through a battery of interviews, got all set, and they rejected me. Atari rejected me, but I did not take no for an answer. I knew Atari was a place I had to be. And so I pushed back, and I just wore them out. And I ended up going for a huge cut in pay and on a probationary status just for the chance to prove myself. And the rest is the history that I destroyed. Want to know about it?
So
Here's the book, all about it.
That's my next question. So in your book, okay, I'm reading this in Tony's.
Okay, I just want to say one thing, is that there's a section in this book called My First Day at Atari, and that was an amazing first day at work. You gotta check it out.
Okay, so in the book, you enthuse about your feelings at the time. You state that you felt that you and Atari were made for each other. Why was that?
Why was it? Atari was the place I was made for. They didn't know it. Because I'm born to do things differently. That's what I did. Most people, when they're going to do something, they say, well, how do you do it? You figure out how to do it, and that's what you do. And I've never done that. I never read directions, I never do that. Even though I made games that demanded people read directions, which was weird, because I never read directions for anything. Because to me, the whole joy is to figure out if you can figure it out and see if you can do it by yourself. And then when you can't, then you look at the directions. So when most people say, how do I do it, and figure out how to do it, and then they just do it the way whatever has been done. What I say is, what are you trying to do? What are we trying to achieve here? And then I just set my brain ticking on that, and I usually come up with some weird way to do it. So even in college, because computer engineering was the third major that I was in. I started off in economics, then I went through math, and I was avoiding computers, and then one day somebody said, you gotta have computers. You're gonna go anywhere in economics, which is what I was studying. And I tried computers once, and I thought, oh my God, I gotta do this. No, it's like all the homework is just puzzle solving. You don't have to read long meandering books. You don't have to write long papers. You just write programs. I thought, this is perfect for me. And I loved it, but because I just have a different way of approaching things. And so since I'm always focused on what we're trying to achieve, I don't have any bias about how to get there. So I come up with weird ways of doing it. So my point about college was, I went to the School of Arts and Sciences first, and everybody said, you don't make sense here. You're more of an engineer. You're kind of one of those engineering dudes. You should go over there. And then in my graduate work, I went to the School of Engineering, where they told me, you're kind of like one of those artist people, aren't you? So everywhere I went, I don't fit in, because I'm always doing things differently. I get the right answers, and it used to frustrate the hell out of people, because they go, that's not the way you do it. Oh, did it work? Well, yeah. So I tend to do things differently. And one of the games I like to play, and I talk about this a lot in the book also, is one of the great things about computers teach us a lot about ourselves. And I think a lot of people don't recognize that. But the biggest lesson computers have to teach us is the difference between what we say and what we mean. Because in a computer, all it does is exactly what you tell it. And a bug is when you meant to tell it to do one thing, but you actually told it another thing. So in human conversation, which I engage in at times, there's whenever you hear someone say, you know what I meant. If that person were programming, they would have had a bug, right? And you know that. And so I like to exploit that. So what I do is when I'm talking with people, I play this game where they say something I intentionally misinterpret it to the extent that I can, to show people how unspecific they are. And people don't always enjoy this, I have to say, but I have a good time with it. And that's something I learned from computers, is that it's really fun to exploit the difference between what people say and what they mean. As a therapist, it becomes even more interesting, because as a therapist, what I do is I help people to really see the difference between what they say and what they mean. Because most people think therapists tell people what to do and fix them. And I don't think it's like that. I think as a therapist, I don't tell people what's going on for them. I help people hear themselves. People know what they need. They know their answers. But we can't always hear ourselves. And so I just help people hear that. So this whole thing of communication, of doing this, computers to me have always been an expression. It's a communication exercise. It's not really a technical exercise. And that was the thing that drew me to Atari. It was the kind of stuff they were doing and the challenge of it, right? Because you think about it, like, you have to be a really good programmer to work at Atari. You had to be a solid programmer, because the programming was, assembly language on a really obscure hardware. It was just a pain. And you had to be the super nerd type to really enjoy having all that garbage in your head at once, and having to be microsecond accurate and all of that. And that was fun. I like that. But the thing is, technical specs aren't that hard to meet, right? When you have a program, and somebody says, write a program that does this, that's not that hard, frankly. What's hard is when you add to the spec, and the person has to enjoy it. Right? Because no one ever looked at a C++ compiler and said, oh, that's way more fun than my word processing. But when video games, you have all the technical challenge, and it has to be fun. So you can be a great programmer and have no sense of fun and not get anywhere. You can spend a year working really hard on something, and it's a waste of time, because it's no fun. And I always approached games as a communicator and as an entertainer, as opposed to as a programmer. Everybody had their own style for knowing. But to me, it was all about entertaining something. It was about, to me, the game didn't take place on the screen. The game takes place in the head of the player. And so when I was programming, I wouldn't think, what's this going to do on the screen? I would think, what is this sequence of audio and video going to do in their brain? And that's the way I approached games, which maybe that's the way everybody else looked at it, I don't know.
So,
That's kind of a long answer to why.
you answered a lot of questions there, so I can skip most of this, or no?
I also kind of skipped ahead a lot. My wife was really irritated.
So, tell us a little bit about the creative process at Atari. I mean, were you just basically left to just do whatever you want?
Oh, yeah. The creative process at Atari. It's another thing I go into extensively. What is creativity? You know, what does it mean to be creative? How do you get something that isn't there? How do you get to a place that there's no map, there's no direction, but it's your job to do it? The great thing about Atari, the amazing thing about Atari was your job. Your job description is to come into work, and at the end of the day, you should have created something cool that did not exist at the beginning of the day. That's a good day at Atari. And we had a lot of days like that. We also had a lot of days where at the end of the day, there's nothing cool here. And those were hard days, because if you're committed to what you're doing, there's a real sense of success and failure. And there was a lot of that at Atari, because it was one person, one game, and you were totally responsible for your game in every piece and every aspect of the game. So when it was a hit, or if it was working, it was like fantastic, because you really got full credit for it. And when it didn't work, when your game sucked, that was hard. That was really rough, because there's no place to hide. It's like, yeah, I've been working on this, and sucks. It's like, oh well. So, but it was very collegial also. So it wasn't like competitive. We were all trying to do really good work, but we were very supportive of one another. So my feeling is a great creative environment is one where there's total freedom, and there's a lot of supportive, open engagement. And the most important thing to have in a creative environment, I've read lots of articles and seen videos on how to brainstorm, how to be creative, do all that stuff. The most important thing you need to have in a creative environment is at least one or two creative people. There are people who are just not creative, and that's okay, because there's ways to do it. Like at Atari, there was three kinds of games. There was original games, there were licensed games, and there was coin-op conversions. And people who weren't super creative, but who were very technically astute, were great for doing coin-op conversions, because they could find ways that we could get something out of it to really represent that hardware. But original games required you to actually come up with an idea from nowhere. And that was very challenging for some people. And for me, that was the only thing I wanted to do. I wouldn't do a coin-op conversion. I mean, which is also interesting, because like when I got to Atari, like my first days at Atari, I went there, I begged my way and pleaded my way in. I took a probationary period, and here's your first assignment. My first assignment was a coin-op conversion. They wanted me to do Starcast for the VCS. And after like 2 days of reading the manual, I went to my manager and I said, this game is going to suck. And I cannot afford to have my first game suck. So although I'm on probation and everything, I know this seems odd, but I don't want to do this game. But I didn't just say I don't want to do it. I said, here's a game I could do instead. And I laid out the design for the game that ultimately became Yar's Revenge. It wasn't Yar's Revenge then, because I didn't make that stuff up till much later. But initially I just had the idea for the play and how to work it, and something that I felt could be done, and it was better attuned to the VCS. And I was lucky, because it wasn't like 6 months later. At that point in time, he said, you're right, go ahead and do that. Go start working on what you want to do. And I did it, and that became Yar's Revenge, which was Atari's biggest selling original game. But if that would have been 6 months later at Atari, they would have said, no, we have a license for this game. You have to do this game, because that's what we do. We do licensing. And Yar's Revenge would never have existed. So I was very lucky to have gotten in at the time I did, or my whole career might have been a very different story.
So after Yar's Revenge, were you feeling pretty confident about programming future games after that? Because it was a huge hit.
Well, it wasn't a huge hit by the time I started doing the next game because it hadn't gone out yet and I was already working on the next game. But it did give me the thing was Yard's Revenge. See, here was the thing. I said, no, that game's going to suck. Let me do Yards. Let me do this other game. It was Time Freeze was the working title I had for it. And so let me do this game. And they're like, okay. And I worked on it for about 2 months, got it all set, got it playable. And it sucked. It totally sucked. I thought, oh no, you're kidding. After I worked so hard to get the opportunity to do this, and now it sucks. So this is it. Now I'm the guy who won't do what they want me to do. I want to do something else that sucks. But I kept after it and got some input and made a few tweaks, and then suddenly it turned into this incredible game that people loved. I mean, people were loving, and I was loving that. And so yes, by the time I was done with Yars, I felt confident and ready to do more games. I really felt like I had established myself as a VCS programmer. And that's when Raiders of the Lost Ark happened.
Well, before we go there, let me see a show of hands. Who loves Yard's Revenge? Oh, yes.
Wow. Well, one thing I would like to tip right now, I don't know if any of you have heard of this, but, because I haven't really announced it much yet.
Oh,
I'm actually going to be doing a Yard's Revenge sequel. You've seen other Yard's Revenge films. I am super stoked about that. This is a design I've had for a long time. All the other Yards things you've seen I've had nothing to do with. I did the original Yard's Revenge. People have done versions of it, offshoots. This is going to be an entirely different game, entirely new gameplay, except it will have the Yards ethos, which is it has to be a total overload of sensory input. It's going to be visually dynamic, and the audio is going to drive you crazy. There's going to be way more going on the screen than was on Yars. And I'm really psyched. And sometime next year, we should be able to get that out to you. So, and it's not going to be a 2600 game. It will have a 2600 version at some point, but there's going to be on a lot of systems. And just want to put that out here. I want to announce that at Freeplay, Florida, that there is a Yard's Revenge sequel. Thank you. That is so cool.
All right, well, now let's move on to Raiders of the Lost Ark. Tell us about the development of that game.
So, with every game that I did, it was super important to me to make it a breakthrough in some way. I wanted every game that I did to be groundbreaking. With Yard's Revenge, there were a lot of firsts that became industry standards. I mean, just my first game, but I had the first full screen explosion, first pause mode, first time an ancillary product was released with the game. It was the first game with a backstory. I actually invented the backstory to video games with Yard's Revenge. And so with Raiders, when it came time to do Raiders, I still wanted to continue this thing. So I decided with Raiders, Adventure, Warren Robinette's Adventure, is a genre-defining, amazing game. You know, it's like a killer app, right? When people came up with video games, the first thing they did was, you know, copy some basic elemental gameplays and things. But, you know, Adventure was like the first real graphical, interactive adventure thing you could run through and be a character and explore. That was an amazing thing. And I thought, if I'm going to do an adventure-style game, which I never really wanted to do originally, because I like action games, I like Twitch games, but I decided I wanted to do something that had to be a contribution. I couldn't just do a knockoff or just something simple. So I decided I was going to make the biggest adventure game on the VCS. It just had to be huge. Now, for me, the biggest game meant the biggest game experience, the most different rooms, different gameplays, different things to find. And, you know, there's always been this thing about Raiders versus Pitfall. In fact, it came down at the Smithsonian Institute and said they were going to pick, you know, the class, you know, what's going to be the adventure game prototype. And they had a vote between Raiders and Pitfall. And Pitfall has more screens. But I think Raiders has a broader impact in terms of different things. But there are different ways to go. David Crane is a brilliant 2600 programmer. Amazing. And so just the idea of being side by side with him in any kind of competition was like, I was super honored. But what I wanted to do with Raiders was make the biggest game possible. I also made one of the most impossible things to deal with, which was using two controllers. And I switched it so that your motion would not be on the primary controller, so people would get the signal they have to pick the other controller. And it was the first of another game where people had to read the manual. And that was a thing that I did that pissed off a lot of players. And because the thing is, video games, you know, there's Bushnell's Law, Nolan Bushnell's Law. In fact, Nolan Bushnell, you can see him in my Once Upon Atari DVD, which we'll talk about that a little later. But Bushnell's Law is easy to learn, tough to master, right? We all know that. And that is a great rule for video games if they're coin-op games, right? Coin-op games have to be easy to learn and tough to master, so people want to put in the first quarter and they keep putting in quarters. Home games, you put all your quarters in at once and that's it, no more quarters, right? So what I figured was, since people are already invested in the game, you can afford to challenge them a little more in learning how to play the game. Because if I can make learning the game a little more complicated, I can make the game way deeper, okay? And that's the trade-off, right? When you go easy to learn, it's hard to make a really deep game that's easy to learn. It has been done. I mean, chess is not that hard to learn the rules. Go is a very simple game to learn. These are tremendously deep games. But they have lasted thousands of years. You know, I don't know that people are going to be playing Yars in 3025. But I did have this mindset of like few rules, large game space. And I decided to, you know, tough to learn, tough to master, I thought was a better formula for home games. Because you can get a larger experience in the home games. And this came back to bite me in my next game. But, so that's where I came from with Raiders. And Raiders did really well. I mean, it was my second million seller. I think, and even E.T. was a million seller. Even after returns, it still sold 1.5 million. So I still believe I'm the only programmer, I think, from the Atari era, the 2600, who every game I released was a million seller. And I did more than one. So I like that. I'm happy with that.
So, in your book, you talked about meeting Spielberg at Universal Studios. How did that go? And did you call him an alien?
So, in order to do Raiders of the Lost Ark, you had to interview with Steven Spielberg. And he doesn't come to you for the interview. So, I just finished Yars, and they said, okay, here's this thing, we're going to do a game for Raiders of the Lost Ark. Who's going to do it? I don't know. Howard's available. Okay. So Spielberg wants to interview the programmer. So I find out, so I'm in San Jose. So I get up like 5 in the morning. I do not, one of the great things about Atari is you never had to get up early in the morning. And I do not like that. But I got up at 5 a.m. and I took a cartridge of Yars' Revenge, and I had a 9:30 meeting in Warner Studios in LA. I took a commercial flight. I took a cab ride through morning LA traffic, which if you've ever been to LA, is like unbelievable. And I made it there at 9:25, on time. And there it is. And I show up and I walk in the door and there's a receptionist. And they look at me and they go, Mr. Warshaw? And I go, yes, you can call me Howard. And she said, your meeting has been rescheduled to 3:30 this afternoon. I'm like, what? I flew here. I had a plane ride to get here. 6 hours? And they go, yeah. And I was kind of pissed off at the moment because I was so groggy. But then I thought, you know, I am a huge film buff. Huge film and TV buff. I was one of those kids who watched 6 hours of TV a day, you know, 7 if there was anything good on. And I thought, well, so I said, can you fix my plane ticket? Can you get me a later flight? You know, first of all, to come to, and they go, oh, absolutely. So I just gave them my tickets. And I thought, that's cool. And then I said, so can I just sort of wander around the studio till then? Sure, go ahead. So I got to spend 6 hours unescorted, rolling around Warner Studios. I went in sets, I just didn't go anywhere they were actively shooting, but I went onto the sets of all my favorite shows. I stole stuff from sets. I took souvenirs. I ate at the commissary with like aliens and ancient knights and things like that. It was an amazing day. And at the end of that, you get to talk to Steven Spielberg, who's like my idol. I love Spielberg. I love his films. But now I'm interviewing with him. And it's like, you know, that was kind of a weird experience. And we go through the end, we played some Yars, and he liked Yars, and he thought that was cool, and we're rolling along, and we're chatting. And then I just couldn't resist. I had this idea. I said, you know, Stephen, I have this theory that you are actually an alien yourself. He said, would you like to hear it? I goes, yeah. And I just laid it out for him. I explained this whole theory about how, you know, we're getting close to making contact, and the aliens, you know, they're not gonna, it's not gonna be like the day the Earth stood still, where they just show up in a spaceship and everybody freaks out. I said, they're gonna be smart enough, if they're smart enough to get here and think about contacting us, they're gonna be smart enough to send an advance team, you know, to culturalize us to get ready to meet the aliens. I said, you've done films, you know, and this time you've only really done Close Encounters. E.T. wasn't done yet. I would find that out soon enough. And I said, you know, Close Encounters has been seen all over the world in every language. You made an alien-friendly movie. And I said, so I figure, you know, you're part of the alien advance team. You're the production arm. And I said, your marketing people are doing an amazing job. And so I just want to say good work. You know, you guys are really well. And I'm looking forward to meeting more of you. And I think that got me the game. So, you know, he didn't really say anything to me. He just sort of smiled. And then I left. And when I got back to the office the next day, they said, okay, well, Steve said you're doing the game. So that's how I got to do Raiders of the Lost Ark.
So he didn't deny it, that he just...
He didn't. And you know, when he was saying it, I can't be 100% sure of this, but I think I sensed a faint reddish glow coming from his chest. It was a very interesting moment.
All right, so as part of the development of Raiders, you had a bullwhip that you would crack around the hallways and terrorize the other programmers. Tell us about that.
I did. Well, not so much the programmers. They were kind of entertained by it. But I did. I got into character for Raiders, so I had like this leather fedora hat, and I got a real 10-foot bullwhip. And I practiced with it. I could crack it. It was like a gunshot. It was really loud. And there were some great moments with the whip. Like occasionally film crews would come by, right? Because every once in a while there's a film crew, they have an extra 30 or 60 seconds to fill that night. And Atari was always good for some B-roll, right? Atari was a place you could go and show some clips of new games and everybody would get all excited. So there was a film crew who happened to be in one of the labs. I didn't know that. And I was doing my hallway walk with the whip, and I walked into the lab to say hi to some of the programmers, and there's this film crew. I'm standing there with a hat and a whip. And the producer, oh my God, get this. And so they run over, and suddenly there's a camera in my face, someone going, is that a real whip? Is that a real whip? And I said, yes, it is. And they go, what's that for? And I didn't know what to do, so the only thing I could think of, I said, this whip is for R&D, research and discipline. I think that created a very interesting production meeting that night. But one of my favorite things to do with the whip was when there'd be marketing people or management people who are not usually in engineering. They'd be walking around, you could always tell the suit walking around. I would sneak up behind them. It was really horrible. And I would crack the whip. Really loud. They'd like, oh, they would like either run or something, or they'd go look for my manager. Oh my God, there's a guy with a whip. Oh yeah, that's it. Yeah, and that was it. So I had the whip sound, you knew that, I'd be coming down the hallway. If you hear like boom, 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 that was Todd Fry coming, the guy who did Pac-Man, because he learned to walk the walls. And the whole explanation of that and the sprinkler lobotomy story is a classic.
It's in the DVD.
It's in the DVDs, multiple programmers. This, by the way, is my Once Upon a Atari DVD. I did this years ago. This was me interviewing all the programmers who actually programmed the 2600. This is all of us telling you exactly what it was like to work on this system, to deal with all the shenanigans and all the crazy stuff that we did and the fun that we had. Nolan Bushnell's in there too. This, Once Upon a Atari, is the book that I wrote. It took me 4 years to write because it just, if I would have known it was going to take me 4 years, I don't know if I would have done it, but I'm really glad I did, because this was an ordeal. But this was, doing video is nice, because you get to edit it and figure out what it is. When you write, especially if you're going to write a memoir, you have to decide if you're going to tell the truth or not. And let me tell you, telling the truth about yourself is not an easy thing. I had to become a therapist to even get close to being able to do it. And, but I did. I decided, yes, I will just let it out. And so the book and the DVD are actually very different material. Because, how many of you have seen Atari Game Over? Okay, so that was a fun movie. And Zach Penn is the guy who directed that. He used a lot of this as research. And we looked at this and he said to me, he goes, Howard, he goes, I really liked Once Upon Atari, he goes, but there was one problem. I said, what's that? He goes, you're not in it very much.
Yeah.
It's true, because I host it. I host this, but it's mostly the other programmers talking. And he said, you're an important part of the story. And I felt too self-conscious to put myself in the DVD that much. I'm there. And so this is me overcompensating for not being in the DVD. But between the two of them, there is an incredible amount of salacious and intense and interesting information and wisdom. That's what some people told me.
So I was telling Howard last night that it took me 20 years to beat E.T. How many, I'm sorry, not E.T., Raiders of the Lost Ark. It took me 20 years to beat Raiders of the Lost Ark. Has anyone else beaten Raiders of the Lost Ark for the 2600? Wow, okay, so 4 of us, we're in a very small,
It's a tough game
to beat. I love it though, it's a great game. All right, so now, given your track record up to this point, with 2 successful games under your belt, you received a phone call. This is one of my favorite, I'm reading this is Tony Temple, of course. This is one of my favorite passages from the book. Ray Kassar was on the other end of the line, and can you tell us what he wanted?
Oh yeah, I was sitting in my office with Jerome Demura, the guy who did the graphics. Some of the graphics for Raiders, all the graphics for E.T. He was my graphics designer and very close friend. He's dead now, actually, which is crazy. And I have his ashes in my office. We were very close. I wound up with his ashes. And so he's still with me. And we were sitting in my office doing what we do a lot of times for fun, which is, how many of you know National Lampoon? Have you ever heard of National Lampoon magazine? Back then it was hysterical. And we used to read letters together. They used to make up letters together. It was so fun. So we used to take turns reading those. And we're doing that. I got a phone call. And I picked up the phone, hello, and she goes, hi, will you hold for Ray Kassar? And I'm like, will I hold for Ray Kassar? The CEO of the company, my boss's 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 boss. Yeah, I'll hold it. And he comes on, he goes, Howard, we need E.T. for September 1st. Can you do it? This was July 27th. And I said, absolutely I can do it, Ray, provided we reach the right agreement. And he said, okay, this was a Tuesday afternoon. He said, okay, Thursday morning at 8 a.m. there will be a Learjet at San Jose Executive Terminal. Be on it. We're going to take you down to see Steven Spielberg and you're going to present the design for E.T. So not only am I going to have to do this game in 5 weeks, I have 36 hours to design the game. And that was how I found out I was going to do E.T. And the way I always think of it is like, I don't know exactly what I was full of, but whatever it was, I was overflowing with it in that moment. Because I truly believed I could do it. I believed I could figure it out. And I did. Okay.
So normally a game like this would take like 10 months to create, and you did it in 5 weeks. And did you take that as a personal challenge?
Absolutely. I mean, that's what motivated me. I mean, 6 months was pretty much, maybe a little under 6 months. That's about the fastest game anybody had ever done on the VCS at that point. I mean, Yars took 7 months, and then it took 5 months of testing. That's a whole nother story, the testing. Yars and Bridge was the last video game they did consumer testing. And they kept testing it and testing it, and it kept breaking records in the testing, and then they wanted more testing because there was someone who was trying to kill Yars Revenge inside Atari, which was a very weird, that's a whole other story, and that's all in the book. But Raiders took 10 months to program, and I had just finished Raiders. Raiders was a long, hard 10 months, and I was just finishing that up when I got the call, you're going to do E.T. So right on the heels of that, without taking a break, without any kind of vacation, boom, dive right in, 5 weeks. I mean, I don't want to really exaggerate. It was actually 5 weeks and a half day. So, and that was it. And what I knew in my head was that if you try to do a 6-month game in 5 weeks, you'll fail. Because you can't do a 6-month game in 5 weeks. That's just stupid. I may be dumb, but I'm not stupid. So what I realized was you need to design a game that can be done in 5 weeks. And that was the challenge for ET, was to design something I knew I could make in 5 weeks. Usually you try to make a fun game, you see how long it takes, and that takes at least 6 months. What I did instead was design a game I could do in 5 weeks and see how much fun I could make. See how fun I could make. And that's what I did. And I just, my whole thought process is painfully elaborated in the book and stuff. I mean, it's like you'll see exactly all the thoughts I went through, everything I wanted to do. It's, and it worked pretty much, but it burned me out. I was so crispy by the end of that. That was the hardest 5 weeks of my life, without doubt.
So why did they choose you to make ET?
They didn't choose me so much as they were left with me. When I didn't, I mean, Ray Kazar calls me out of the blue to say, hey, we'd like you to do a game. That never happened. That doesn't happen. So I thought that was weird. I didn't really think about it for a while. I was too busy thinking what I'm going to do for the game. It turns out that he had called my boss's boss, my grand boss, before me, because they had just completed the negotiations with Spielberg and those people to secure the rights. That's why it started on the 27th of July, because that was the day they finished the negotiations. Those negotiations probably had gone on for months. And if they would have finished those negotiations like a month earlier, I could have had a lot more time. You know, if they would have finished it 5 weeks earlier, I would have had twice as long to do the game. I could have done that game twice. So,
ET2.
it took them so long to negotiate, and then he called my boss's boss, and he says, hey, this guy's the head of VCS development, we need a game for September 1st, for ET. And he said, can't do it. Can't make a game in 5 weeks. Cannot do it. It's too little time, it's too late. Now, what's interesting is the head execs at Atari never asked development at any point, how long does it take to make a game? Never occurred to them that it might be a difficult thing. They never consulted with them. The whole time the negotiations were going on, it was the super top secret negotiations. They didn't even let the people who would make the game in on it to see what the possibilities were. So after the head of the VCS development told him you can't have the game, he still called me for some reason. And I had had a couple of interactions with him before this that influenced him to try and contact me. Also, I heard subsequently that Spielberg asked for me to do it. Spielberg said, you know, I think Howard should do ET. And he was like, but the real thing is that no one else would do it. I mean, no one else would touch this. And I have proof of that because 3 days later, it was my birthday. Okay, so this is my birthday present. My birthday was, you already lost 10% of your schedule. And on that day, there was a department meeting, and they announced that Howard's doing ET. And everyone's like, oh, God, Howard gets to do all the game. Howard just did Raiders, blah, blah, blah. You know, and it was like real grousing. And so I stood up in the meeting, and I said, hey, I said, ET is due September 1st. This is July 30th. I said, anybody who wants it, you can have it. Anybody. Crickets. Nothing. I never heard another complaint again. To this day, no one has gone through and said, oh man, I wish I could have done it. That's never happened. So it was, but I made the offer. And no one would take it. I was literally the only person in the Atari universe that was whatever enough to decide to actually do it. And I believed I could do it, and I did what I could.
So after you were given the game, you traveled to go see Spielberg again.
Yeah, this time it was a much nicer traveling accommodations, that's for sure. So I spent the next 36 hours working up a design, a few elementary drawings, and Jerome helped me with some design drawings. Run down to Spielberg's place. I go into great detail about the Learjet ride, what that was like, because it was really cool. That was the first time I'd ever been on a private jet. pretty close to the last time I'd ever been on a private jet, too. But that was cool. That was really cool. And, and there were limos, and people are popping up, and here we go, and we're on our way to Warner Studios, and we get to Spielberg's office, and then it's time to present the design. And, when I finished Raiders, I made a videotape of Raiders. I actually played through Raiders, made a whole videotape presentation of it, showed that to Spielberg, my idol. And here's Spielberg reviewing the videotape of a playthrough of my game for his movie. And he looked and he goes, "Oh, Howard," he goes, "that's really great." He goes, "It's just like a movie." And I was like, yeah! I was like so psyched. That was like sweet. And so here we go again. And so now I'm going to lay out the design. I lay the whole design out for him, and he looks at me. After hearing the whole thing, he goes, "Couldn't you make something like Pac-Man?" And I'm like, what? It like really bugged me because, here's this innovative guy. This guy I really respect. He wants me to make a knockoff, but I didn't say that. I had some choice responses in mind because I do think pretty quickly at times. And I was going to come back with a really snarky thing to say, and then fortunately I stopped myself just in time to, get a grip, Howard. Steven Spielberg, he likes Pac-Man, whatever. The truth is, I couldn't do a Pac-Man style game in 5 weeks. There are a number of genres of game that I eliminated right away because they require too much tuning. And the one thing I knew was I was not going to have any tuning time. In fact, it's an interesting thing to think about. Is if someone comes up to you and says, "Hey, how did your project go?" And you were to say to them, or you say, "Hey, how'd your project go?" And they say, "I achieved 100% of my original design." You would think that was a pretty good delivery, right? I mean, most people would probably feel pretty satisfied with that. The truth is, that's a disaster, okay? Because most successful products deliver maybe 15, 20% of their original design. And the reason is because it gets better along the way. Because you change, you update, you learn as you go, and you start making modifications to the original design because you can. And you end up producing a better product, and that's the way a lot of solid product developments go. The one thing I knew about this development was there would be no time for rumination, no time for thinking, no time to get away from it and come back to it with fresh eyes. So I was going to have to deliver just my initial design. So I felt a lot of pressure on the design to make something I felt would workable. But so I was thinking, one of the biggest problems for ET was that I did deliver 100% of my original design concept. What a disaster.
So towards the end of the development of the game, you were pretty much done, crispy, as you say.
Yeah, it was insane. I worked all the time. I tried to find ways to work when I was sleeping. Which was I wouldn't have a normal sleep cycle. I actually had a development system moved into my home, so I didn't have to do commute time, which wasn't that bad. It was like 15-minute commute at the time, but still I couldn't afford it. Also, if I woke up in the middle of the night with a solution, which sometimes happens to me, I wanted to be able to just get it down right away and put it in and test it. So I actually had a system moved in. I was like working around the clock. I would work until I was either tired or stuck, and then I would go to sleep. And sometimes you dream something, you think, "Oh yeah, there it is." And I had a few of those where I woke up and I thought, "Yeah, there it is." And you sit down, in the dream it worked, but couldn't actually do it. But it was working around the clock all the time for 5 weeks. I took one day off, and that's when it was snowing in August. That was a wacky day. But yeah, it was grueling. So by the end, I was starting to snap at people. I was getting really rough at them. I mean, I have some snappy comebacks sometimes, but generally I'm a pretty cordial individual, but I was really starting to lose my cool. And I could feel it, I could see it. I was reaching the end, I was so close. You could see it in sight, and it really was, this was a thing that was going to be done August 31st, right? So it wasn't going to be done before then. So it was like there was very little margin for error, and there was, I'll tell you a great story. And this also illustrates, the thing I talk about a lot is like technology and technologists and programmers, and programmer brain is something I go into quite a bit. And I think it's very interesting to understand how programmers think differently from normal people, you know? And so, I'm driving down the road, programming in my head like usual. And I'm on an expressway, so it's a fairly intense thing, and there's some lights occasionally on it. And I'm coming up to a light, and I notice that the cross traffic, this is literally how this occurs in my head. I see the cross traffic, and that's what I watch for. I don't really watch signs and lights that much. I watch for other vehicles that might hit me. That's what I pay attention to on the road. And I notice the cross traffic, they're not slowing down. I'm thinking, oh, they should be slowing down. I'm coming through. You know, these people should be slowing down, and they're not. And so, and then I caught a look at their light, not my light, but their light. I actually looked to see in their direction, what's the light there? And I looked at it, I thought, oh, their light's green, no wonder they're not slowing down. And then I thought, you know, if their light's green, my light's probably red. And it was only then that I actually looked at the light in front of me and thought, holy shit, it's red. And I hit the brakes. And I skidded up just a little bit into the crosswalk just before I entered the intersection. And I was like, oh, man, I gotta remember that code sequence. And it was like, that was a very embarrassing moment. And then when the light finally did change green in our direction, nobody moved around me. They all wanted to see what I was going to do first. And I took off and got out of there. I was just so glad there were no cops around, because that could have really delayed, you know, my time if I would have gotten a ticket or something, let alone arrested.
Yeah, he was more worried about the game not getting finished than
I really wasn't. That's how deep into this that I was, and it was dangerous. And that was there was only one other time I almost killed myself on the project that one, but it was intense. It was a very intense time.
So you finally finished the game. At what point did you start to realize that people didn't really seem to care for it?
A long time. So that's the thing. Everybody asks me, you know, well, you know, it's so tough here and all that. E.T. always felt like a success to me. It really feels like a tremendous success to me. Because first of all, I did the impossible. I made a game in 5 weeks. It passed quality assurance. It got through. It did it. I'm not saying the game has no problems. The game has some real problems. And I can tell you all about that. But it was a done, finished game. And I don't think it's anywhere near the worst game on the system. But when it was done, when it was first finished, it was just hooray. Everybody was there. They had an assembly. They had this huge meeting at Atari. And they called me up on the stage. Oh, we're going to send them to Hawaii. This is so great. You know, thank you. You came through for us. And I was the hero. And I delivered the product. And it was great. And then, and this is, you know, September 1st, right? That's when it was due. And then, you know, it goes into manufacturing, and it takes a while for it to go. And then here comes December. And now, in the beginning of December, E.T. and Raiders are 2 of the top 7 or 8 games in sales on Billboard's top 10. So I have 2 games in the top 10. So smoking big cigars. It's all good. Right? So far, all the feedback that I have is super positive. Right? And nobody's really playing the game because everybody's buying it as a Christmas present. So a lot of people are not buying it. And there's no internet. Right? You have to remember, this is still pre-internet. So there isn't like this wave of chat groups that are going on and trashing it and going all about it. That's going to come later. So